Everyone makes a list of the biggest empires in history. They pull out a map. They measure the square kilometers. They rank them largest to smallest and call it done. But square kilometers do not conquer themselves. They do not move goods. They do not produce knowledge. They do not protect citizens. The true measure of an empire is not how much land it colored on a map. It is what it did with that land. What it changed. What it built. What it destroyed. And how long its influence lasted after it was gone. Today we are ranking the 10 most significant empires in human history. Not the largest. Not the longest lasting. The most significant. This list will surprise you. Number 10. The Portuguese Empire. In the early 15th century, Portugal was a tiny kingdom on the edge of Europe. 1 million people. Surrounded by a more powerful neighbor that would have happily absorbed it. What Portugal had was the Atlantic Ocean and navigators who decided to treat that as an opportunity. Between 1415 and 1499, Portuguese navigators sailed down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and into the Indian Ocean. Before this, the spice trade between Asia and Europe passed through Arab merchants and Ottoman territory. Every intermediary took a cut. The Portuguese route eliminated all of them and connected the Atlantic world to the Indian Ocean world for the first time in history. But Portugal's most devastating contribution was the slave trade. Beginning in the 1440s, Portugal built the infrastructure that eventually carried 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. They were responsible for 40% of the entire transatlantic slave trade. Small country. Enormous impact. In both what it opened and what it destroyed. Number 9. The Ottoman Empire. 623 years. The longest lasting empire on this list. Its significance is not about size. It is about position. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire sat at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Every overland trade route from Asia to Europe passed through Ottoman territory. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 ended the last institutional continuity with the classical Roman world. It also complicated the overland trade routes that motivated the Portuguese exploration and Columbus's voyage west. The Ottoman millet system allowed Christians, Jews, and Muslims to govern their own communities under a single political authority. When Jewish communities were expelled from Spain in 1492, the Ottoman Sultan invited them east. And when the empire finally dissolved in 1922, Britain and France drew the borders of the modern Middle East with straight lines across complex human geographies. Those lines continue to shape conflicts today. Number 8. The Achaemenid Persian Empire. Western education treats this empire as the villain defeated by the Greeks at Marathon and Thermopylae. This completely inverts the actual historical relationship. At its height under Darius the Great, the Persian Empire governed approximately 44% of the world's entire population. That proportion has never been equaled by any empire before or since. The Achaemenid Empire was not primarily a war machine. It was an administrative innovation. The satrapy system allowed the empire to govern diverse populations across vast distances without suppressing local languages and practices. The royal road stretched 2,700 kilometers and allowed messages to travel its full length in approximately 7 days. The Persian Wars were from the Persian perspective punitive expeditions against troublesome Greek cities on the western fringe of an enormous empire. When Alexander the Great finally conquered Persia, he deliberately preserved the Persian administrative system because it was too sophisticated to replace. Number 7. The Abbasid Caliphate. This is the empire that gave the world algebra. Also trigonometry. Also the decimal number system that everyone on Earth now uses. Also the first hospitals as institutions. Also the systematic preservation of Greek philosophical and scientific texts that eventually fueled the European Renaissance. In 830 AD, Caliph al-Ma'mun established the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Scholars of multiple faiths and backgrounds worked together to translate, extend, and correct the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra. The word algebra comes from his manuscript title. The word algorithm comes from his name. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine was a standard medical text in European universities for 5 centuries. And then in 1258, the Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan sacked Baghdad. The House of Wisdom was destroyed. The libraries were thrown into the Tigris River. Contemporary accounts describe the river running black with ink from the destroyed books. The most significant loss of accumulated knowledge in human history. Number 6. The Roman Empire. Rome requires no introduction. Its roads, its law, its language, its religion, every dimension of Western civilization carries the Roman imprint. At its peak, Rome had a GDP estimated at approximately 25% of global economic output. Roman coins have been found in China. Roman goods have been found in India. The Roman monetary system functioned as a reserve currency for the ancient world. Roman legal concepts, contract law, property rights, the distinction between public and private law, are still operational today in legal systems governing more than 3 billion people. And there is a lesser-known lesson from Rome that every government should study. In the 3rd century AD, facing costs they could not meet through taxation, Roman emperors systematically debased the silver content of their currency. A coin nearly pure silver in the 2nd century contained only 2 to 5% silver by the 280s. The inflation that followed destroyed the empire's economic foundations. An ancient lesson in monetary policy that has been repeated throughout history ever since. Number 5. The Mongol Empire. The largest contiguous land empire in history. And the most destructive force in human history measured by percentage of world population killed. Scholarly estimates suggest the Mongol conquests killed between 30 and 40 million people. Possibly 10% of the entire world population at the time. In some regions, population levels did not recover for centuries. But the Mongol Empire also created something extraordinary. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, from 1260 to 1350 was a period during which the entire Eurasian trade route, from China to the Black Sea, was under a single political authority. For the first time in history it was possible to travel from one end of the Eurasian continent to the other under the protection of a single empire. This is the context in which Marco Polo traveled to China. The Black Death also traveled these same routes. The infrastructure that moved silk and spices also moved the bacterium that killed 1/3 of Europe's population. The Mongols connected the world. What traveled along those connections included both commerce and catastrophe. Number 4. The British Empire. 24 million square kilometers. 500 million people. 23% of the world's population at its peak. 4 generations, British imperial history was taught as a story of civilization brought to less developed peoples. The genuine contributions were emphasized: the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade after 1807, railway infrastructure in India, the spread of English common law. The violence was generally minimized. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed between 2 and 3 million people, not because of crop failure alone, but because of wartime policies that diverted food and restricted movement. Winston Churchill explicitly opposed relief efforts. The Irish famine killed approximately 1 million people, while the British government committed to non-interference in markets. The Boer War concentration camps killed 28,000 Boer civilians and 20,000 black Africans. The term concentration camp was coined in this British imperial context. Economic research has estimated that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion in value from India between 1765 and 1938. India's share of world GDP went from 24% to 4% under British rule. Number 3. The Han Dynasty. Contemporary with Rome. Two great civilizations at opposite ends of Eurasia, developing parallel achievements without any direct contact. The Han established the imperial examination system, a meritocratic selection process for government officials that would define Chinese governance for the next 2,000 years. The Silk Road reached full operation under Han patronage. Paper was invented during the Han period. And the cultural legacy of the Han is visible in the fact that China's dominant ethnic group calls itself Han Chinese today. 2,000 years after the dynasty collapsed. That is how deep 400 years of governance can reach into the future. Number 2. The Umayyad Caliphate. The Umayyad Caliphate accomplished in 89 years what Rome took centuries to achieve. Within a generation of Muhammad's death, Arab armies had conquered the Persian Sassanid Empire and stripped the Byzantine Empire of Egypt, Syria, and Palestine. Within a century, the Islamic Empire extended from Spain in the west to the borders of China and India in the east. The fastest territorial expansion in the history of any empire. And the civilization built on this territorial foundation, the Islamic Golden Age, produced the mathematical, medical, and scientific knowledge that became the intellectual foundation of the European Renaissance. The Umayyad expansion and the Abbasid Golden Age are causally connected. Without the Umayyad conquests, there is no House of Wisdom. Without the House of Wisdom, the Renaissance has almost nothing to work with. Number 1. The Maurya Empire. Under Ashoka the Great, the Maurya Empire governed approximately 40% of the world's entire population. Ashoka was one of the most aggressive military conquerors of his time. His campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga resulted in victory, and 100,000 dead, 150,000 deported, and multiples of that number dying from disease and famine in the aftermath. Then Ashoka converted to Buddhism and renounced war. What is unusual is not the conversion. What is unusual is what he did with it. He issued edicts, carved on rocks and pillars across his empire, proclaiming religious tolerance for all faiths. They described duties of welfare toward subjects, animals, and the environment. They established government officials whose specific job was protecting all religious communities within the empire, not just Buddhists. He explicitly renounced war as a tool of territorial expansion. The most powerful man in the ancient world. Governing 40% of humanity. Choosing tolerance over conquest. This happened in approximately 260 BC. The Ashokan edicts represent the earliest documented articulation, in any culture, of something approaching universal religious tolerance, as a governing principle. 2,300 years later, India chose Ashoka's wheel for its national flag, and his lion capital, as its national emblem. His wheel still flies today over the world's largest democracy. This is why the Maurya Empire ranks first. Not because it was the largest. Not because it lasted longest. But because it produced a moment in which a man, at the absolute apex of worldly power, looked at what he had done and decided to become something different. And then actually tried. That is the most significant thing any empire has ever done.